In the previous two tutorials, we took a look at the data definition language commands of SQL, namely the create table command, the alter table, and the drop command. So create table, alter, and drop commands, we looked at various examples of it. And with this tutorial, we are going to start looking at the data manipulation language, or DML, commands of SQL. And the commands in particular that we'll be looking at, you can see over here, are select, insert, update, and delete. So we will begin with the select command because it is by far the most well-known command in SQL, and it's also the most complex, having many variations and parts to it. So we may need more than one tutorial to cover even the select command, but let's get started. Excuse me. And the way we will study these commands is just as we have been doing in class. Namely, I will show you the command, the syntax, the grammar of the command on paper, and then we'll actually go to an Access database and run these commands and see how they operate and what kind of results they produce. Now, the actual database that we will be using when we run the queries is the same employee project department database that we created using the SQL DML commands. If you recall, we use the create table commands to actually create this database, create the tables, enforce referential integrity, enforce entity integrity, all those things we have already done. So we will use this database now to learn how to extract information from the database. I have already preloaded this database with data for you. We will see later on in another tutorial how one uses SQL to populate a relational database. But for now, just not assume that this table actually has data in it. I can show you, for example, the employee table. Here is the data for employees. If I double click on project, here is the actual data on projects and so forth. So this database has actually been populated with data, and for now you don't need to worry about how the data was put into the database. So you can see it's already there. So let's start our examination of the select command. So this is the data manipulation command that we are beginning to look at, and as I said, it's the most complex command of all of them, and we will spend a good bit of time on it. So first, the grammar of the select command. So here you can see the general grammar, meaning the different parts of the select statement, what it consists of, and what we will gradually see what each of those parts represent. So a select statement starts with the word select. It has from, it has to have from, and then these other statements, other qualifiers that you see over here, these are called clauses, okay? So you can have a where clause, a group by clause, a having clause, order by clause. We'll gradually see what they are, but those four clauses, these four, the last four, are optional in the sense they are used as and when needed. And as we get to more and more complex queries, now we will see how they're used and when they are used, okay? But we'll start off with the simplest SQL select statement, which involves the select and from, okay? Now, before we proceed with the grammar further, let me just point out something which should be fairly obvious. So if you take a relation, a relational database consists of a bunch of connected relations. You already know that. So let's look at a particular relation over here. This is the employee relation. So if I want to extract any information from the table, okay, so you can see that the only operation that I can do on this table is that I can cut it horizontally and I can cut it vertically. Okay, so let's say if I want this particular cell, if I wanted this particular content FA2, basically what I would have to do is cut horizontally across this table for employee number 8 and then cut vertically on position. That would give me the cell FA2. All right. So later on, you will see as we start to look at the select command in SQL in greater detail, you will find that they are simply grammatical ways of cutting up tables vertically and horizontally. So any information that you want from a relation can be obtained by a combination of horizontal and vertical cuts. If you just keep this thought in mind, understanding the select statement becomes pretty easy. Okay, so let's go back to the select statement that we had started to look at. So here is the first and the simplest select statement. As I said, every select statement starts with the word select, okay, and must contain the clause from. Okay, so what do these two parts refer to? So here is the employee table. So as we start looking at the select statement, we will first begin by seeing how you extract information from just one table. And later on, we will see how to extract information from multiple tables at the same time. So we'll start with one table, and we're looking at the employee table, and I've gotten a sample of it. I've shown you a slice of what that table looks like. Okay, so suppose I want the names of all employees in the database. All right, so just without knowing the select statement, just graphically you can see what I really need to do is take this employee table that you're seeing over here, this employee table, and I just need to cut out these two columns, isn't it? I need to pull out these first two columns. So I need to do a vertical cut of this relation down those two columns. All right, so that is essentially what this statement does, the select statement that you see over here. So what are the two parts? The first, the select part, the select clause, that's the technical term we should say. The select clause lists the columns that you want to pull out vertically. Okay, and the from clause tells you the table from which that cutting needs to be done. So there could be multiple tables in the database that have first name and last name. So you have to tell the database management system which table to do the cutting from. So here we are saying select first name, last name from employee. And when we do that, Access will go ahead and slice out those two columns. So let's go to Access and actually execute that query and see. So here we are. Let me, well, we can keep this relationships there. Let me do the create and create query design, close, and I go to SQL view. So I'm going to be a little lazy. I'm just going to copy paste. Since I've already written the command, I don't want to waste time typing it all over again in Access. So here's my command. Notice that every SQL statement ends with a semicolon. Okay, so let me run this query, and here you can see the output. So you remember the employee table that I showed you a few minutes ago, and all that Access has done is that it has sliced out these two columns, the first name and the last name column. So you get the first and last names of all your employees. So that's what this select statement has done. So let me go back to the SQL view and delete this in preparation for the next query. Go back here. Now, if I want all the columns, let's say I want the entire table, then of course I could say select first name, last name, department, position, supervisor, office phone. I could list each one of these columns and then say from employee. Okay. Now the shorthand for listing all the columns is the star. So if we say select star from employee, it lists all the columns. So the star is a shorthand for all the columns. Let's run this query and see. Copy. Here we are, and we run this query. You can see the whole table has been output by Access. So star is a shorthand for all columns. Okay. All right, so I hope you're beginning to see what these two clauses in the select statement looks like. So you must have every select statement. Select is used for retrieval. You're retrieving information from the database. So it must start with the word select. After the word select, you list the columns that you want to cut out vertically. For the moment, we're not talking about horizontal cuts. We'll get to those later. And after the from word, the clause, you must list the relation from which the cutting is being done. And star is simply a shorthand for all columns. Okay. All right, let us proceed further with more complex examples here. So now here's the so let me correct this. So this is list the details of the employee whose supervisor is employee 6. Okay, so that's the query that I want answered. So let's take a look at the table first. So you can see in the supervisor column, you have a list of the name, you have the number of the employee who is the supervisor. Okay, so for instance, Ken Evans, if I look at this particular row, Ken Evans, it says CFO, and it says that Ken's supervisor is employee number 1. And employee number 1 is Mary Jacobs. So you know who is the CEO. So Mary Jacobs is the supervisor of Ken Evans. Similarly, we have Heather Jones in accounting, whose supervisor is 6. Okay, so we would need to go to employee number 6. Employee number 6 is Ken Evans. So Ken Evans supervises Heather Jones. So I hope you understand what the supervisor column means. So if you look at this particular SQL query, it says select star from employee where supervisor equal to 6. Okay, so what this does is it cuts the table horizontally. Everywhere, every row for which supervisor is equal to 6 gets cut out, gets pulled out. Okay, so when I run this query, what I should get is all the rows in which supervisor is equal to 6. So let's try that. So, sorry. So I Control C for copy. I go back to Access. And I'm going to paste this query and run it. Okay, so do you see now that out of the table, the employee table, out of all the employees, Access has pulled out only those employees for which the supervisor is equal to 6, and it has cut the table completely left to right horizontally. So this is an example of a horizontal cut. So now going back to the select statement, we have these 3 parts to the select statement. I told you at the beginning that we must have the select clause and we must have the from clause. Okay, the where clause, whether you have it or not, depends on whether you're trying to do horizontal slicing. So in this particular question, we want to only pick out the rows for which supervisor equal to 6, and hence we have to do a horizontal slicing. Okay, so we can modify this query a little bit. Suppose I say, give me the first name and last name of employees whose supervisor is employee 6. So I don't want all their details. I just want to know their first name and last name. So you can just graphically, you can imagine how you would do that. You would first cut the table horizontally for all the rows where supervisor is equal to 6. So once you have, so if you look at this particular output, here are all the rows for which supervisor equal to 6. So if I only want to know the first and last names, what I need to do is take this answer and simply cut out these 2 columns, vertically cut them out. Okay, and how do I do that? You remember from a couple of queries back that I would say select first name, last name. Okay, so the column names after the word select does the vertical cutting and the where does the horizontal cutting. So in this one select statement, we have a combination of horizontal and vertical cutting. So let's run this query, and do you see now that you don't see the entire row, but you only see the first name and last name of employees for whom the supervisor is employee number 6. Okay. All right. Let me delete this query again in preparation for the next one. So here's another example. Let's say I want the last name and first name of employees who work in the finance department. Okay. So I could list star over here. That means I would get the entire row. But the difference between the first example here and the second example here is that in the first example, the searching was based on a number which said supervisor is equal to 6. And in the second example, the horizontal cutting or the searching is based on a character string. We are saying department equals finance. We want to know the details of all employees who work in the finance department. The reason we are showing this particular example is simply that you have to put quotes around a character string. If you're cutting a table based on a character, on a words or character string, you have to put quotes around the character string, whereas you don't put quotes around a number when you do the horizontal cutting. So let me copy this command over. So I'll just copy this, move over to access, paste, and I have to end this with a semicolon. Now, if I try to run this query, I'll probably get an error message, and I want you to see that error message. Yeah, so I get an error message because it doesn't recognize the word finance, it meaning access. And the reason is simple. These are little quirks that you have to get used to and the reason it's not working is because in PowerPoint, these quotes in PowerPoint are not the same as the quotes in Access. So all I have to do is redo the quotes. I'll just replace it with a single quote. So I delete this and I put a single quote again, and I run this. Now you get all the employees who are in the finance department. So you can see there are only 2 employees who are in the finance department, and the Microsoft Access has cut the whole table horizontally. Okay. So going back to the query, this where clause has done your horizontal cutting. All right. It didn't do any vertical cutting. Now, suppose I want to do vertical cutting. I only want the names, first name and last names of employees in the finance department. I would, of course, write first name, comma, last name. And if I run it, then I only get the first name and last name. So this is a combination of horizontal and vertical cutting. So I hope so far so good. We have started with the simplest select statement. We said, just to recap, the select statement is used to retrieve information, and for the moment we are looking only at retrieving information from one table. And we said that the select statement has to start with the word select. You follow that up with the columns that you want to cut vertically. After that comes the from clause, where you list the table from which you're doing the extraction. And the where clause may be used depending on whether or not you need to do horizontal cutting. If you need to do horizontal cutting, then you use the where clause. And I showed you 2 examples of the where clause, one of which involves cutting based on a number and the other one cutting based on a character string. Okay. All right. Let's stop this tutorial. Now we'll continue with this just to keep the length of the video manageable. We will continue with the more examples. There are many more examples of the select command. We will continue with that in the next tutorial.